Hello and welcome to Radical Engagements here at Varn Blog. And today we're discussing In Cyberspace, Delusion is Power, or The Childish Delusion by Nicolas de Villarreal. Nicolas Nico is one of the most regular guests on my show, writer for Cosmonaut and Palladium, and now Default Blog, which is run by another former guest of the show, Catherine D. And this is a discussion about the incentives and the psychological incentives of the internet today, read through a very particular lens. But let's get right into it so we can discuss it. You can find this on Default Blog over at Substack, and I will link it in the show notes as well so that you have no problem finding this material. Let's make it a little bigger so you can see it for those of you who are following along on the video. And we're going to skip the little preamble. It's a little too big. By Catherine D. All right. Long quote. Many passages in Freud's work show that he felt the need for a complete articulation of the symbolic order. For this is what was at stake for him in neurosis, to which he opposed psychosis, where at some time there has been a hole, a rupture, a rent, a gap, with respect to external reality. In neurosis, in so much as reality is not fully articulated symbolically and into the external world, it is in a second phase that a partial flight from reality and incapacity to confront this secretly preserved part of reality occurs in the subject. In psychosis, on the contrary, reality itself initially contains a hole that the world of fantasy will subsequently fill. Jacques Lacan, The Psychoses. The young boy is not necessarily edgy. He is inherently edgy. The sharpness of an edge that is determined by how much the world it cuts off. Baroque spiral, theory of the young boy. We have an illustration which I believe is by Nico himself. Very reminiscent of Homestuck. For those of you who know that. We have, and it says, "You've seen too much TV. This isn't a cliched script written by a hack. It's reality. This isn't a TV or a magazine. You're no hero either. You know your role. It may be cliched, but if it's cliched, that just means it's someone else. It's something everyone believes." And now we start with Nico. One thing that the internet has taught me was that there are people out there who desire to be mad, that is to say, to be insane. And I don't mean this in a glib way as commentary on people becoming increasingly deranged via posting, although there's plenty of that. Nor really a commentary on the subcultures of self-diagnosis. If you've ever spent any time on Instagram or TikTok, there's a ton of that. Although it seems to have died down a little bit lately for lid posting, but anyway, that might just be the algorithm for me. I mean, it is in the most sincere way, the way that people whose deepest, most heartfelt desire is to be mad. This is the motivation and the driving engine at the art of every cyberspace movement in the past 20 years. Anonymous, Gamergate, QAnon, MAGA communism, Zezians, even more mainstream movements such as the fourth wave feminism, rationalism, the Sanders and Trump viral presidency campaigns. And when I say that the energy powering these movements is a desire to be mad, I do not mean that they are powered by madness. On the contrary, the ideological blinders that they suffer from are part of the human condition. Only the most extreme fanatics truly grasp their heart's desire. What I mean instead is what they are born from, the desire deep within to reshape the self, one's very soul, into a weapon. A desire mentally possible to act on by the collapse of socializing institutions and modern liberal democratic societies. When there's less and less public space where there's multiple eyes on you and you can't, because there's multiple eyes on you, your ability to shape and reshape yourself is limited by your communal participation. You don't see as much of it. I mean, it happens. The Great Gatsby is about someone trying to do that, But now everyone can do it and relatively easily. Back to the commentary. Some 70 years ago, the French made almost the exact opposite claim, that the desire to be mad doesn't actually make one mad. He made this claim during a particular place and time, having lived through the 20th century heights of mass political parties, garrison states, and institutional power. This was an empirical observation for Lacan. It was obvious to him, not a consequence of his elaborate theories, which are often very elaborate. And yet, from the perspective of the present, I'm sure most people sufficiently online can think of counterexamples, or at very least, by the end of the essay, I hope that you will be able to identify the phenomena. In this respect, it is useful to review the most banal example, that of Chuuni or Chuuni, a cultural idea from Japan used to describe the delusion suffered by middle schoolers, dreams of having magical powers or arcane knowledge. The term was originally coined by a comedian in the 1990s, and by the late aughts, he had backed away from it as it had now begun to be taken far more seriously. I personally picture this transition from the changes in the depiction of youth and the social realist sorts of anime. In the 2004 anime Paranoia Agent, and this tells you how I think of anime, Paranoia Agent, even though it's literally 21 years old at this point, I think of as new anime as opposed to the anime I grew up with, like Ninja Scroll. All right. Which follows the lives of a number of different ordinary people who felt as though they were backed into a corner, and among the cast are two middle school boys. The two boys both have their own delusions about the power dynamics in the school and come into conflict with one another, but also do a good job of hiding these delusions. And just as key, these delusions were ones that were socialized into via the school and traditional family dynamics, aka it's the outside world infecting the inside world and making it more delusional. Over identification with these outside worlds, right? Kind of like the way that those of us who were socialized before the aughts interact on the internet with the monicum of in-person socialization guiding that. Because while the internet has been around in some form for most of my life, it was not easily accessible until I was like 16 or 17. All right. Compare this to the 2010 anime Durarara, which also has a social realist type of story, which focuses on a number teenager in Tokyo. Unlike Paranoia Agent, where the conflict was driven by a universal type of anxiety, the conflict in Durarara is created by the delusions of the teens themselves. In a world where the supernatural does actually exist, the desire to escape the ordinary or be a badass and manipulate others or pursue idiosyncratic ideas of love, all drive ordinary people to the more bizarre and unpredictable than real monsters. What I think is important here is that the delusions of the characters cease to be informed by how they were socialized. In fact, they were an attempt to escape the limits of the socialization of the world and family life. So instead of family life kind of colonizing the mind and infecting and priming the kinds of fantasy world these middle school boys go into, here we have the opposite. We have a kind of carving away of a space of insanity where delusions remove one from those pressures. And so in that sense, the delusions are an escape. And back to what Nico says here. In that sense, the delusions are totally self-generated, albeit with a little help from cyberspace. The internet in this way provided a new dimension to the symbolic universe of childhood delusion. I believe this reflects something true to life, that there was a change that occurred in the 2000s in the way people were socialized. Delusional children became active in the production of the broader symbolic universe in a new way. Whereas once it had been the case that age, gender, and social status of participants in a subculture or a counterculture would have been obvious to outside observers, or would have required a transition for the participants in youth culture to be counted as full adults, that ceased to be the case with the internet. How many times have I been talking to someone who was 16 years old and I thought they were 30? Happened a lot. happened a whole lot, and it started happening around 2010. It became harder and harder for me to identify who was young and who was old by even the way they were speaking, because people my age affected very online internet jargon, which actually would indicate that they were younger than they actually were. The pseudo-anonymous nature of cyberspace makes the product of this delusion just as real as any other symbolic representation of reality online, and to all observing subjects. Indeed, this was something important to the plot and themes of Durarara. Empirically, we see this phenomenon in many places, particularly in the way childish fandoms have become more important to the internet culture as a whole. And I would argue that like political fandoms are actually modeled on childish fandoms, not on political organization in the past. And I think this is actually why there's so much more niche and diehard reactions, because there's no need for a fandom to be rooted in material reality or sharing things in the real and direct world. Anime, gaming, cartoons, things of this nature have a particular role in the immediate symbolic universe of children and teenagers. And when they experience them, they will always connect what they see back to other things in their life and psyche. Lacan, in his interpretation of Freud and psychoanalysis, describes Freudian concepts not in terms of biology, which is interesting and actually progressive for Lacan. It's different from, say, Lasch or Freud himself, but exactly in this culturalist way, that the bodily functions and the family relations are so important to our daily lives that they are necessarily important parts of our symbolic universe by the nature of their correlation to signs and symbols. And Nico's going to throw some semiotics here, some very basic semiotics, and we could complicate this greatly, but we're going to stick with it. Therefore, creating a certain structure to the universe, the same idea can be applied to the media during the formative moments. I am not the first person to notice this connection between Chuuni, self-delusion, and the pathologies of the internet movement. In the book Theory of the Young Boy, Baroque Spiral effectively paints a picture of the semiotic and libidinal structures of these movements. The titular young boy is not a literal young boy. It is rather a bundle of correlated signs and behaviors, Wittgensteinian family resemblance, basically. Anti-correlated to a similar bundle called the young girl, a theoretical object of the edgy French anarchist collective and anarchist communizers called Tikkun. In short, the young girl was a gestalt portrait of modern capitalism, turning people into docile and vapid plastic mass consumers. And that seems very early neoliberal and Fordist. It doesn't seem like today, right? But let's get to what Nico's going to say here. The young boy, in turn, represents the various rebellions to this docility, aka the alt-right, aka what kill all normies, aka a bunch of things, attempting to find symbolic points of resistance to the system. If it is a gendered concept, it is only in this purely oppositional sense, rather than literally referring to the gender of the subject and can stand for it. As Baroque Spiral says, and this is why I don't love these metaphors, because they're actually kind of confusing. But anyway, the unsettled status, like the pressure and desire-driven conformity of the young girl, can also be universalized to anyone who fails the impossible program of becoming a young girl and attempts to realize the desire she mediates from the opposite direction, a failure that is just as carefully engineered. Like the young girl, the young boy is obviously not a gendered concept. The black bi gender disabled feminist blogger confirms to it just as much as the R9K slash R slash R9K slash gym cell with a whirring gun collection. The 40-year-old blue check holding on to an increasingly deranged grudge against some anonymous trolls, and the helplessly self-referential e-girls paneling to her haters, both a beta concept of the young boy. I'm adding that to make it clear. It was written before blue check was made to mean something else, but I think you get the picture. Chuuni behavior is one facet of this young boy's psychology, but at the same time, this apology also shows the extent to which many other phenomena share the same characteristics as Chuuni. The young boy harbors intense delusions about the symbolic universe. They fixate on signifiers they find, usually in cyberspace, and take them to mean something of great significance, to be a threat to the actually existing order. What exactly this order is thought to be by the young boy varies greatly. It could be globalism, capitalism, communism, modernity, patriarchy, matriarchy, the political establishment, online content moderation, fandom shipping in groups, the scholarly collective unconsciousness are the masses themselves. The point is, as Baroque Spiral makes clear, is that this oppositional position, which is created from a single source, the failure to live up to the commandments of this order, which in a postmodern capitalism are so totalizing they become the symbolic water which we breathe and swim. These are the commandments to enjoy, and if not quite to be normal in a conformist way of our foremost grandparents, to sublimate our most perverse, uncontrolled enjoyment directly into the inescapable demands of social reproduction, whether it is within the family, the university, or the workplace. The young boy is dissatisfied with the commodified, fully socialized demands on his desire, the type of socialized desire represented by the young girl. These commandments stand in for a whole order of the world, a symbol for the way things really work, and therefore, when people find themselves stuck outside of this order, they will try to find a place of resistance to it, and just like the commandments themselves are a symbol, they reach for the other symbol held in opposition. What is unique about the young boy compared to the young girl is the sheer variety and obscure esotericism of these points of symbolic opposition, which started emerging in the internet culture really early. You started seeing really weird revivals of ideas, hybrid ideologies that don't even make sense and definitely couldn't be embodied in the real world. This all becomes more possible in a place that is primarily driven by writing, posting, and speaking. This is not, I would argue, just a result of the rebellion against conformity as such. Previous rebellions of its type were actually remarkably similar in the points of resistance to social power identified. Think about all the counterculture stuff in the 90s and the 70s. They all worked this way. The variety of the young boy's symbolic universe is the direct result of the breakdown of socialization that occurred everywhere in the developed capitalist countries. The disappearance of clubs, associations, mass political parties, churches, unions, a common media environment, and even extended family connections has meant that there are a few opportunities for people to become fully socialized. Have all those eyes on you all the time, right? Shaped into specific subjects required by our society to function. These sorts of institutions are what Louis Althusser, the French philosopher and associate of Lacan, called the state ideological apparatuses. I think it's a little confusing to call them state, but I've always had that critique of Althusser. He said that they were interpolated, that is, called people into certain ideologies. Church, for example, calls us when they tell us the good news that we are sinners but we can be saved. When people accept the call, that interpolation, they change their own understanding of themselves as well as they change their internal understanding of the world. And of course, in order for these institutions to do the calling, there must be people to do the speaking. And when one speaks with a certain ideological discourse, just like praying, the act of doing so cements their position as a subject of a type certified by their ideology. The act of praying, partaking sacraments, certifying one's identity as a Christian to oneself. So, too, are these institutions generative of ideology, not just merely repeating the same message throughout history. Ideology production entails a stringing together of new symbols and signs, literally expanding on the realm of meaningful statements. With the loss of these institutions, therefore, 20th century people lost both the things that which promptly socialize them into the roles in society and the ability to articulate their circumstances and values through official channels. It is into this absence that cyberspace has arrived in place of official state ideological apparatuses, all that Fordist fun stuff. The internet has allowed delusional young boys the means to auto-generate their own socialization and ideology. You don't need to be socialized by other eyes in a direct way who could also respond to you immediately. You need to be socialized in a kind of 2D way that is still about other eyes, but not other eyes that can discipline you in any meaningful sense other than by, I guess, cyberbullying. Think of all the social media accounts, blogs, YouTube channels, and Twitch streamers built around the premise. The production process for ideological partisans that hardly have any grounding in real life, official institutions, even though they occasionally get co-opted after the fact. Okay, then, one might then begin to say that this is a clean replacement of what was lost, a regeneration of socializing institutions into the digital world, but this is not the case. Thank you. Thank you, Nico, because it isn't the case. Precisely because of that desire to be mad I spoke about, the beating heart of the young boy. It is simply not the case that this desire was entertained in previous socializing institutions. It was meant to be suppressed and sublimated into properly normal behavior. In Lacan's time, you really could not go mad simply because you wanted to be. And that is no longer true. And the delusions of psychosis, Lacan suggests that people reject the gap that exists between their symbolic universe and the real, and therefore try to fill it with their imagination, extrapolating from signifiers available to them, words, symbols, categories, and their relations to other signifiers rather than the signified, which is the actual meaning. Although I'm going to say, I think Nico needs to problematize actual meaning a little more, because that's actually really, really hard to prove. It was semiotics that led to the family resemblance theory, or the negative theory of meaning. So meaning is a set that has bracketed things out, and what's left is what's in the word. That's one way of conceptualizing Saussurian linguistics. Anyway, in order to make it seem as the gap did not exist, and people love their delusions as if they were loving themselves. After all, you're the source of your own delusion, so why wouldn't you love them? Anyway, this is a constant empirical observation of psychoanalysis and ordinary experience. People experiencing real psychosis are not the people who wish to be mad, but the sort of operations going on there of cutting off signifiers from their meaning, of repurposing them to fill a deep gap, is the sort of thing which is desired. People desire to be delusional. Of course, they do not desire to be delusional in the same way as a psychotic, and there is no sort of primordial jealousy, for the most part, of those who do, or who are locked up in mental hospitals. Rather, what people want is to be delusional in a way that is directly advantageous to them and other goals and desires they have. People wonder, quote, if I could be ontologically good and my enemy is ontologically evil, or what if I could accomplish if I disregarded everything in the world for my goal, or more simply, what is possible if I just give up on being normal? And even if in that moment they know these statements to be untrue, are fights of flancy. They believe fundamentally that delusion is a source of power. Ouch. The logic behind these ideas, it is necessary to go deep. To understand the logic behind these ideas, it is necessary to go deeper into the logic of the signifier and the signified. Into semiotics, the science of signs and symbols. That's debatable, but I do think it's a scientific study. So, but there, I could talk about the reason why it's debatable, because we don't have a actual super clear framework on the relationship between signs and signifiers ultimately. Signifiers are things which stand in for other things. Letters can stand for sounds, words for ideas, or even phenomenal experience. Sentences have particular meaning. Think of a simple substitution code. For example, a restaurant menu that has a number to stand in for particular dishes. In the elementary way, each number is a signifier and each dish is a signified. But we can't stop there. For when we decode a code, what we are left with does not automatically establish the meaning of the signified. Let's say this restaurant is a very fancy Italian place, and every number stands for a different type of pasta. For the uninitiated, would there be any means of distinguishing all these pasta dishes? Perhaps, like a young child, they may only know pasta or spaghetti and are unfamiliar with linguine and fettuccine. In order for the signified to have meaning, you have to relate to it, to compare it, and everything else, such as that divisions emerge. Just as well, the signifiers must be distinguished from one another in order to convey distinct meaning. In the case of the restaurant code, repeating a number or jitters fonts will be quite confusing. How is it then that we speak of the meaning of a code? When we arrive at its decoding, that when we point to the number 1, we mean the spaghetti. The process of pointing to a decoded statement, of isolating a part of a system of signs, is a process of sign function collapse. A sign is a signifier-signified pair, one slice of a code where the two elements are connected. We can further break up signs into basic types of first order and the higher order signs. First order signs refer directly to something real. Higher order signs refer to other things which may or may not be real. Within a given signifier, we usually see both the first and the higher order signs. To understand what is meant by this, consider apple juice. If you were in your first time hearing the phrase and you knew apple and juice were, you could probably piece together what apple juice was by combining the two ideas. This is an apple juice as a higher order sign, as is created with the reference to other signs. In contrast, if we take apple juice as a proper name for certain substances, the golden sweet tasting liquid, and it becomes a first order sign, moving away from the understanding of apple juice to the second, for example, by forgetting what apples and juice mean, would be sign function collapse. Hence, when I use I to point out a spaghetti qua spaghetti, we're collapsing the sign function, which previously might have been encompassed the entirety of code, which is compared to the spaghetti to every other type of pasta. For the young boy and the Chuuni, sign function collapse is a process by which the delusions are produced, whether it is done consciously or unconsciously. For actual young children learning the ropes of the broader symbolic universe of their society, the experience of sign function collapse is less likely actively cutting off a web of signs from signifiers, and more like the fog of war. All signs we learn as children, after all, have to come to us in a specific sequence in time. Hence, a child might learn what juice is before they learn what apples are. A situation might radically change their understanding precisely what apple juice is compared to the alternative. For adolescents and teens, the media they are exposed to will show up in their active fantasies of society at large. But exactly what part of the media is a fantasy is not something that arrives all at once at first glance. For the most naive, magical powers, our superhero abilities might be taken up literally as a correlative to having actual power and agency in the world. As we get older and learn more about the symbolic universe society has created for them, as they get older and learn more about the symbolic universe society created for them, the reverse process begins to take hold, attempting to collapse the sign function in order to regain those childish delusions. And in present day society, where socialization has been broken, this takes the form of desire to be mad. In these self-induced delusional subjects, these desiring to be mad, sign function collapse promises to be wielded in a way which would directly in line with their desires promises to cut off huge chunks of the world. And whether the world's waiting to be discovered or whether they already know and desperately just want to reject it. In the psychotic, according to Lacan, the subject extrapolates from the symbolic signifiers in order to fill the capricious gap between their symbolic world and reality, and indeed all operations on the signifiers in this way. When we add 2 plus 2, rather in the calculator of the mind, sorry guys, we are only ever dealing with the symbols rather than the Platonic form or other essences of the number. We don't know if those essences exist. But unlike with addition, these operations produce outputs which are not necessarily valid. Let's say something applied to the theological logic of the Holy Trinity to their relationship to their boss and spouse, and that's the kind of thing we're talking about. This extrapolation of signifiers that's unhinged from a grounded sense of reality creates a psychosis and associated delusions. And all such unhinged extrapolation requires the sign function collapse, for otherwise the complexity of a sign's connection with the sign for realness would interfere with this delusion. The sign for the real, for reality, is after all a higher order sign, and collapsing it flattens our world, making many other things that should have been a higher order signs into the first order signs, making our delusions just as real as the sun on our face, the air in our lungs. The young boy wishes for his own sort of delusion motivated delusions, not the overdetermined type of the psychotic, yet it still requires the sort of suspension of disbelief, the sign function collapse. Now we can begin to make sense of Baruch Spiro's comments on the sharpness of the young boy's edge is determined by how much of the world it cuts off. When it comes to a child's delusion, the less that is known about a sign, the more powerful all-encompassing a signifier can be. For the youngest Chuuni, belief in magic and supernatural is operationalized by ignorance of what magic and supernatural actually means. This is what gives their delusions power. For the edgy young boys, actively cutting off their knowledge of the world creates the same effect. This is where the internet revolutionaries come in, producing the ready-made signifiers from the aspiring delusionals. That's funny. What has the past decade of impotent hacktab hacktivism, protest, and even random violence amounted to except blind faith in the various signifiers and their ability to disrupt the order of the world. And the focus on hashtags and signifiers as the way to disruption, as opposed to like leverage systems or organized and disciplined groups, probably has to do with market capture. But anyway, let's go back to this. Of course, the side of normalcy and order also relies on delusions plenty. But there is a key asymmetry here. The real know-how of making normal worlds tick operates at a more fundamental level than delusions. The basic facts of life, jobs, family, schools is institutionalized in a way that reproduces itself. In many ways, there's a little revenge of the young girl here, whose consumption and well-socialized delusions actually work in practice, unlike the young boys who are increasingly in a positive feedback loop, creating more and more chaos until they throw themselves down a spiral. A Baroque spiral, perhaps. A Baroque spiral. The problem with the edginess of the young boy is that, by the very act of cutting off the world to facilitate these illusions, the responsibility for creating concrete alternatives to the existing order he is trying to tear down is lost. There's no positive politics. It's just all negative politics. This is not to say that there is not a practical minded people involved in the internet movements, particularly those with more mainstream political consequences. It's simply that the intrinsic motivation behind the virality of these movements runs counter to this practicality. At the limit of the desire to be mad, the role of the signifier and sign function collapse borders on accumulating in actual psychosis. Yep, this is what I talk about. Oh, we're talking about Sinfest. I read Sinfest when it first came out in the early 2000s. I read it from like panel 1 because a friend of mine read it and we started reading it together when we were working for the school literary magazine after 9/11. Anyway, so I followed Sinfest for a long time. I think I dropped out actually about the time where Tatsuya went crazy, which is about 2011. All right. The comic began in the early aughts as a fairly standard, even well-written and drawn cartoon of the sort that you could see in the Sunday paper. Yeah. But as Tatsuya entered the internet age about 2011, I think the internet age starts in the 90s, Nico, but nonetheless, he became increasingly radicalized, first as a strident feminist, then some sort of waves of reactionary conspiracism, like QAnon, anti-Semitism, etc. As the comic evolved over time, by its very nature, the readers will be treated to direct access to what the signifiers the author identified as points of opposition to the matrix-like metaphor of choice in the comic, oppressive nature of the symbolic order of the broader society, beginning with female sexuality and ending in neo-paganism. Yeah, there was flirtations with Christianity in there. There was some definitely like pretty explicit anti-Semitism. I remember picking it back up when there was a debate around all this, I guess, like in 2021. And me reading Sinfest and going, what the fuck happened? Anyway. And it did feel a lot like the way a lot of the internet went. All of a sudden, Newgrounds and 4chan felt completely dangerously unmoored. Unmoored, very good, because it comes up next. Unmoored from reality. This is where the logic of the young boy ends up. An endless invective stream of signifiers that impotently try to kick the shins of the failing order. You're just constantly inventing negative signifiers, which aren't connected to anything. But there is a quality to all of this that's a bit like like a child putting on their parents' clothes and pretending that it imbues them with all the authority and power of an adult. Reflecting back on the Cambrian explosion of online ideologies, I find this undeniable. And I've seen these Cambrian explosion of online ideologies roll out now for at least 2.5 decades. Since 9/11, I feel like I started seeing stuff like, ANCAP monarchism, which, did have historical precedent and actual real world thinkers like Hans Hermann Hoppe. But I started seeing more and more of it. As the internet age comes of age, which I think is fair. I think the internet age would be about 25 or 30 in my mind. It seems this quality is just as well infiltrating actual halls of power in government and corporations. Yep, it seems like people are increasingly not caring about the systemic consequences of what they do. They, to use a quote by Skyla Scanshin, the 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 economics author and TikTok and YouTube presenter, are just externalizing their pain and calling it policy to our collective detriment. How else should we take the recent extremes in which the tariff policy, except to see tariffs reduced to a signifier within some larger fantasy, one that is arbitrarily invoked, where the sign function collapse has destroyed the actual knowledge of how the economy actually reproduces itself among those in power? Like I said, you can reduce state capacity, you can build up industrial capacity, you can tariff to incentivize industrial capacity, or you can do direct investment. But you need to do at least two of them to really work. And Trump has only done one, and everything else cuts against it. And his tariff policy seems to be mad bluffing all the time. So it's hard to know. As the difference between Trump 1 and Trump 2 becomes more apparent, which is also there's less and less people pushing back on Trump. You know, that's his party's not pushing back on him. He's not forced to make deals internally. He's willing to trade competence for yes men to ascend to this vision of the world that he has. It's become clear to me that the ascendancy of those socialized by the anti-socialization of the internet, such as political staff, have embraced this lack of responsibility for making things work. Although I would say, I would push a little bit back here, Nico. We started seeing this in the Bush administration too. And that can't be blamed on the internet. Like, there's something else here. I tend to think it has to do with complexity, but I think the internet reflects and exacerbates it as a feedback loop. But I don't think it's really the source. But the childish delusion doesn't necessarily have to be defending the quality of cyberspace ideology, for the close enough obsession with the point of resistance to the symbolic order may eventually produce a desire to understand the signified, the materiality of this order. The trouble is that this materiality of order is located in reality, or at least something closer to it, and therefore will not necessarily produce the same desires as the existing desires for delusion. Overcoming this childhood comfort found in these signifiers is part of growing up, and much of growing up is necessary. This reminds me of Christopher Lash's sort of like use of the Freudian view of narcissism. There's secondary narcissism, which is what the culture of narcissism is about. And he was writing about Fordism, not neoliberalism, where one identified oneself with institutions and political movements because one cannot tell where one ends and those things begin. And thus, when those hit material walls, you focused on the self as a means of continuing them. So you went into the 70s and 80s me decades while pretending your countercultural consumer obsessions and lifestyle choices were somehow the same kind of politics you engaged in the late 60s. This is what was often accused of the younger silent generation and the baby boomers. So then there is what he talks about in the minimal self, where one goes in the primary narcissism and one cannot tell the difference between oneself and one's environment. And if one follows this out, I've talked about, like, you know, the step after that, because the other thing that Lash is trying to do is to tie these into political economy and a feedback loop of political economy, right? And what you see there is an explosion and a collapse. Well, it's something to think about, because I think we're going to see a lot more people who are increasingly wanting to be unhinged. Take care and protect.